Commander Nathan Wells sat in the Grand Conference Hall of the Galactic Council Station and listened to the sound of alien voices discussing the nature of war. Nathan had spent 30 years studying military tactics from 100 different species, and he understood their approaches to conflict better than most humans who walked the corridors of military academia. The Kron Empire representative stood at the podium first, a tall crystalline being with sharp edges that caught the light. He spoke about warfare with the precision of someone discussing mathematics. He explained how the Kron calculated every move, weighed every resource, and retreated when the equation no longer favored victory. There was no emotion in his voice, just data and strategy. Nathan took careful notes because the Kron were effective and their methods had worked for centuries. Next came the Vex collective representative, a fluid being that seemed to shift with each word she spoke. The Vex approached war differently. They believed in overwhelming force applied at the exact moment of maximum weakness. They did not negotiate. They did not show mercy. They simply identified targets and eliminated them with brutal efficiency. Nathan understood their logic. He had seen the results of their strategies across a dozen conquered worlds. The Sethari Dominion representative was last and perhaps the most unsettling, a being of pure intellect that communicated through harmonic frequencies. The Sethari viewed warfare as a problem requiring optimization. They studied human conflicts with particular interest and found them chaotic and unpredictable. They did not understand why humans fought when surrender might be the logical choice. They did not comprehend sacrifice or the willingness to lose everything for an abstract concept like freedom or family. When the representative from the Sethari finished speaking, the other aliens in the room seemed to nod in agreement to each other. They all shared the same fundamental understanding: the war was a tool to be used when beneficial and abandoned when not. War was about winning or achieving objectives. It was never personal. It was never about anything beyond strategy and survival. Nathan listened to the questions from the other species representatives. They all asked about efficiency and resource management. They discussed kill ratios and territorial gains. They analyzed the mistakes their enemies had made from the perspective of pure tactical analysis. No one spoke about courage or sacrifice or the strange way humans sometimes fought harder when losing than when winning. During a break in the conference, Nathan walked to the observation deck that overlooked the station. He could see the vast expanse of space beyond and the countless ships moving through the void. Each ship belonged to a different species. Each one carried soldiers or fighters trained to execute the tactical doctrines he had just heard presented. Nathan thought about what he had learned and what he had never heard mentioned in that conference room. He thought about his own military career. He had studied alien tactics so thoroughly that he had almost forgotten what it meant to be human, to fight for something beyond the mathematical optimization of victory. He had learned to think like the Kron, to calculate like the Vex, to understand the cold logic of the Sethari. And in doing so, he had begun to lose something that he could not quite define but felt acutely. In this moment, his communication device vibrated. Nathan checked the message, and his breath caught. The civilian colony on Kepler 442b was under attack. The Valorian Syndicate was known throughout the galaxy as brutal and effective mercenaries. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They simply took what they wanted and destroyed what they could not take. This was a crisis that required his immediate attention. Nathan gathered his data tablets and headed toward the docking bay, where a military transport awaited. He would travel to the colony and assess the situation, provide military support, and help coordinate the defense. What he did not know was that he was about to have an experience that would change everything he believed about warfare, about humanity, and about the difference between knowing about something and truly understanding it. The journey to Kepler 442b took 3 days. Nathan spent the time reviewing records of previous Valorian attacks. They always followed the same pattern. They identified a target, assessed the defenses, and overwhelmed the defenders through superior firepower and ruthless tactics. The Valorians had never faced a human colony that truly resisted. They usually found that civilizations surrendered quickly when facing the certain knowledge that resistance would be futile. But something about the Kepler 442b colony was different. Nathan could feel it in the briefings he read. The colony had been established only 7 years ago. It was primarily civilian, focused on research and settlement rather than military strength. The population included families with children, scientists and engineers, and farmers. People who had come to build something new, not soldiers trained for combat. As the transport descended toward the colony, Nathan could see the damage from above. Buildings were damaged. Defensive walls had been hastily constructed across the colony perimeter. There were no military installations here, no advanced weapons platforms, no heavy armor. The colonists were using whatever they had available to defend themselves and their homes. Landing at the emergency zone, Nathan stepped out and felt the gravity of Kepler 442b pull at him. The air smelled of smoke and something else, something that he could not quite identify. It was only later that he would realize it was the smell of fear and desperation, and something else, something that the aliens at the conference would never mention. A woman in a medical coat approached him. Her name was Emma Rodriguez, and she was the chief medical officer of the colony. She was covered in dust, and her eyes showed the exhaustion of someone who had not slept in days. Behind her came Lucas Park, the emergency coordinator, who looked equally worn. His clothing was torn, and there was a cut across his forehead. Emma and Lucas explained the situation to Nathan. The Valorians had been attacking for 3 weeks. They were systematic and ruthless. They wanted to enslave the colonists and take the colony resources. The humans had resisted so far, but they were running out of supplies and ammunition. The next major attack could come at any moment. As Nathan listened to their report, he began to understand that the conference he had just left had been discussing something abstract and theoretical. But here on Kepler 442b, war was real and immediate, and it involved people who had names and families and reasons for being here beyond strategy and resource optimization. Nathan realized he was about to see something that the alien representatives had never truly witnessed. A human colony fighting not because the equation favored them, but because the alternative was unthinkable. He was about to see human fury firsthand, and he did not yet understand how profoundly it would change him. The medical facility on Kepler 442b was a converted administration building that had been hastily transformed into a trauma center. Nathan walked through the corridors and saw the reality of 3 weeks of conflict. Injured colonists lay on makeshift beds. Some were civilians caught in bombardment. Others were volunteers who had been defending the colony perimeter. The facility was understaffed and undersupplied, but the work continued without pause. Emma Rodriguez moved between patients with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for days without rest. She checked bandages, monitored vital signs, and made decisions about treatment with a calm authority that impressed Nathan. She was not a soldier, but she carried herself like one. Someone who understood that the lives depending on her required focus and precision. She did not have the luxury of doubt or hesitation. Nathan observed her work and realized something that the alien representatives at the conference had never discussed. When humans face crisis, they did not simply calculate and execute. They became something more focused and capable, driven by purpose that transcended the purely logical. Emma was a doctor first, but now she was something more, a protector of the wounded, a keeper of life in the midst of chaos. Lucas Park found Nathan in the corridor and began showing him the defense preparations. The colonists had constructed barriers from industrial equipment and heavy materials. They had positioned what few weapons the colony possessed at strategic points throughout the settlement. The positions were not ideal, but they had been created with ingenuity and understanding of the terrain. Nathan could see that Lucas had spent considerable effort thinking about how to use limited resources for maximum protection. What struck Nathan was the organization Lucas had created. There were volunteer groups assigned to different sectors. People who worked in different professions had been organized into defense teams. Engineers understood structural vulnerabilities and had reinforced weak points. Farmers knew the surrounding land and had prepared fields for potential retreat or flanking positions. Scientists had been assigned to medical support and supply management. This was not a trained military force, but it was organized and purposeful. As Nathan and Lucas reviewed the preparations, the emergency alert system suddenly activated. The Valorians were launching another attack, but this one was different in its target. The enemy was attempting a direct assault on the residential sector, where most of the colonists' families were sheltered. Everything changed in that moment. The academic discussion of defense strategies became immediate. And visceral Nathan watched as colonists who had been going about emergency preparations suddenly moved with new purpose. People he had seen moments before performing routine tasks transformed into defenders. A man who had been helping Emma carry medical supplies rushed to his family shelter to ensure his children were safe. A woman who taught science classes at the colony school picked up a rifle she had been trained to use and moved toward a defensive position. Lucas was coordinating responses through communication devices, barking out instructions and updates. His voice was steady, but Nathan could hear the underlying tension. The attack was hitting hard. The Valorians had brought significant firepower, and the colony defenses were being tested immediately. Nathan positioned himself where he could observe the entire situation as it unfolded. This was what he had come to witness, though he did not fully understand it. Yet, the colony residents were fighting, but not with the cold precision he had heard described at the conference. This was something different, something driven by something other than tactical calculation. A young man named Adam, who could not have been more than 17 years old, approached Lucas requesting permission to run supplies to the forward defensive positions. The route was exposed and dangerous, but the supply runners were running low on ammunition. Adam volunteered without hesitation, without calculation of his odds of success. He simply understood that the position needed supplies, and he was capable of delivering them. Lucas looked like he wanted to refuse, but he knew the supplies were necessary. He gave Adam the assignment, and the young man moved out immediately. Nathan watched as Adam sprinted across open ground where Valorian weapons fire tracked and snapped around him. The youth did not freeze or hesitate. He kept moving, kept focused, kept his eyes on the objective. He made it through and delivered the supplies to cheering defenders. That was remarkable enough, but what happened next was even more striking. Adam turned around and ran back through the same fire to get another load of supplies. This was not a logical decision. The risk was enormous. The odds of surviving it twice were minimal, but Adam moved with determination that transcended fear and calculation. He was not thinking about probability. He was thinking about the fact that his colony needed him, and he was capable of providing what was needed. Emma worked frantically in the medical facility, treating an increasing stream of wounded. The facility was becoming overwhelmed, but she remained focused. She organized her volunteer medical assistants with precision and clarity. She made difficult decisions about treatment. Priority with the kind of authority that came from knowing that lives depended on her decisions. She did not hesitate. She did not show doubt. She simply acted. Elsewhere in the colony, an elderly engineer named Marcus had been assigned to maintain and coordinate the improvised defensive systems. He was not trained for military engineering, but he understood systems and infrastructure. He had spent hours rigging together weapons platforms and reinforcing barricades. He had created firing positions that maximized the protection of defenders while allowing maximum field of fire. When one of his systems was damaged by enemy fire, Marcus left the safety of his position and moved to repair it. The repair exposed him to fire, but Marcus understood that the system was critical to the defense of his sector, he made a rational decision that the mission need outweighed his personal safety. He fixed the system and returned to his position injured, but functional, and the defense held because of his action. As the hours of combat continued, Nathan observed the pattern repeating throughout the colony. Over and over, he saw people making choices that defied pure logic. They chose to protect others over themselves. They chose to fight when surrender might mean survival. They chose to remain engaged even as fear and exhaustion mounted. They did not discuss their choices or debate options. They simply acted with focused purpose. A mother named Victoria helped coordinate the civilian shelters, ensuring that children and non-combatants remained as safe as possible given the circumstances when ammunition was running low at one of the 4 positions. Victoria organized supplies from throughout the colony and helped deliver them to the defenders. She was not a soldier, but she moved with the determination of someone protecting her community and the families who depended on her decisions. The motivation of someone protecting her community and the families who depended on her community and the families who depended on her decisions. The attack lasted for hours. The Valorians pressed their assault but found resistance more organized and more determined than their previous encounters with human colonies. The defenders did not break. They did not surrender. They did not fall back except when tactical necessity demanded. They fought with a focused intensity that the Valorians had not anticipated. When the attack finally ceased and the Valorians withdrew to regroup, Nathan realized that the colony had survived, but something had shifted in him as well. He had spent 3 decades studying war from a distance, understanding it as both strategy and calculation. But in watching civilians defend their home and their families, he had witnessed something that no conference room discussion could have prepared him for. He had seen the moment when ordinary people became extraordinary. He had seen the transformation from civilian to defender not through training or indoctrination, but through choice and commitment. He had seen human fury, focused and purposeful, beginning to emerge not as chaos, but as something far more dangerous, far more effective, and far more difficult to predict than anything the aliens had discussed at the conference. The siege continued for another 2 weeks, and during that time, Nathan witnessed the complete transformation of the colony from a civilian settlement into something far more formidable. The Valorians clearly believed that they would eventually break the human resistance through attrition and sustained pressure. They did not understand what they were facing. Each day the Valorians attacked, and each day the colony defended. The attacks were methodical and calculated exactly what Nathan would have expected from the military perspective he had studied for decades. But each day the response from the colonists surprised him. It became more coordinated, more effective, more unified. Each attack was met with resistance that seemed to strengthen rather than weaken. Nathan began to understand that the Valorians were operating from the assumption that humans would eventually surrender, that resistance would eventually prove too costly. But the Valorians did not understand something fundamental about the human beings they were facing. The colony residents were not fighting because the equation favored victory. They were fighting because the alternative was unthinkable. The colony had 342 people. This included 63 children under the age of 12, 119 adults over the age of 60, and dozens more who had no military training whatsoever. Yet somehow, in less than a week, this population had organized into an effective fighting force. The transformation was not the result of military instruction. It came from something deeper, from a choice to defend their home and each other regardless of odds. Nathan watched as workers from the construction sector abandoned their tools and took up defensive positions. Some had never held a weapon before arriving at the colony, but they learned quickly. They understood that their colony was under attack and that their participation in the defense was necessary and urgent. They did not question the assignment. They simply moved into position and prepared to fight. Teachers became supply coordinators. using their organizational skills to manage ammunition and food and medical supplies. They created systems that ensured every position received what it needed. Teachers understood how to organize information and resources, and they applied those skills to the logistics of defense. A teacher named Sarah had created a system so efficient that supplies were distributed faster than they were being consumed. Engineers became tactical advisors. They studied the terrain and the colony layout and suggested defensive positions and approaches that capitalized on their knowledge of the physical space. Marcus, the elderly engineer, had become indispensable. His understanding of the colony infrastructure allowed him to create defensive positions that others would have never considered. His improvised weapons platforms had killed more Valorian soldiers than any conventional defense could have managed. Farmers became scouts. They knew the surrounding landscape better than anyone else. The land beyond the colony walls held no mystery for them. They reported on Valorian movements and positions, provided early warning of attacks, and on 2 occasions they had guided small defensive teams through terrain to attack Valorian supply lines. A farmer named Robert had prevented a major assault by sabotaging enemy equipment before it could be positioned for attack. Emma Rodriguez continued working in the medical facility, treating wounded and training volunteer medical assistants. Her small clinic had become a field hospital. She had no advanced equipment, no surgical suites, no support system beyond what she could create herself. Yet, she saved lives that should have been lost by any conventional medical standard. She worked 18-hour days without complaint, without hesitation, never questioning whether the effort was worth the cost. The most striking transformation took place in the young people of the colony. The teenagers and young adults who had known only peace at Kepler 442b found themselves capable of courage and determination. They had never imagined Adam, the supply runner, who had volunteered on the first day of heavy assault, had now become crucial to the colony defense. He ran supply missions dozens of times. He was wounded twice but returned to duty both times. When asked by another young person if he was afraid, he answered with simple honesty that of course he was afraid, but that his colony needed him. Victoria, the mother who had organized the civilian shelters, found herself making decisions that affected the survival of entire sections of the colony. She coordinated evacuation routes. She organized non-combatants into support roles. She kept morale high through her own example of courage and calm under her direction. The civilian shelter systems became so efficient that casualties were minimized, even when the colony took direct strikes. What struck Nathan most was the absence of calculation in their actions. These people were not discussing acceptable losses or running simulations about retreat strategies. They were not comparing their resources to those of the Valorians and calculating probability of success. They simply fought because surrender was not an option, because their families were here, because their homes were here, because the alternative to fighting was allowing an enemy to take everything. One evening, as Nathan stood on an observation point overlooking the colony, he watched the defenders preparing for the evening attack. He saw people who were clearly exhausted, clearly frightened, clearly aware that they might not survive the next hours. Yet, they were focused. They were organized, they were moving with purpose. He saw a farmer giving encouragement to a teacher who was assigned to his sector. He saw a construction worker sharing water with a medical assistant who had come up to the defensive line. He saw Emma, exhausted from a day of treating wounded, still finding strength to check on a young man who had arrived at her medical facility with a serious injury. He saw Marcus working on a defensive system in the open where he was exposed to fire because the system was necessary and his knowledge was irreplaceable. He saw Victoria moving through the civilian sectors, ensuring children understood that their protectors were doing everything possible to keep them safe. This was something that the aliens at the conference would never understand. They thought of warfare as a game of strategy and resources. They thought of soldiers as interchangeable units to be deployed and sacrificed according to calculations. But what Nathan was Witnessing was something far more powerful and far more frightening. The colonists were not fighting because they were ordered to fight. They were fighting because they had decided that certain things mattered more than survival itself. They were fighting to protect children, to preserve their community, to maintain their dignity and their freedom. These were not quantifiable factors in any strategic calculation. Yet they were clearly the most powerful forces driving human resistance as another. Valorian attack began that evening. Nathan stood with Lucas and watched the defense respond. The coordinator was moving between positions, providing information and encouragement. His voice was steady. His decisions were quick and decisive. Yet Nathan could see the toll the ongoing pressure was taking. Even Lucas was feeling the weight of constant conflict, but what Nathan realized was that the weight was not breaking them. It was forging them into something stronger and more unified. The colony had been fractured by the normal divisions of any community before the conflict. Different people with different interests and different perspectives. But the shared struggle had unified them into something approaching a single organism, a collective purpose that transcended individual preference. After the attack ended that night, Nathan asked Lucas what kept them fighting when surrendering would end the conflict. Lucas looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said that they were fighting because they were humans, and humans chose to protect what mattered to them rather than accept loss in the name of survival. He said that the Valorians would never understand that some things were worth dying for. That was the difference between strategy and conviction. That was what the conference had missed. The moment came without warning. On the 18th day of the siege, the Valorians had captured 3 defenders in a successful raid on an outlying position. They brought the prisoners to the edge of the colony and broadcast an ultimatum. The colony would surrender immediately and submit to enslavement, or the prisoners would be executed. Nathan watched from the command center as Emma recognized one of the prisoners. He was a young man named David who had worked with her in the medical facility, delivering supplies and assisting with patients. Emma went very still when she realized what was happening. David was barely 20 years old. He had volunteered for the advanced position because someone needed to defend the colony. He had accepted the risk without hesitation. Lucas watched the transmission with an expression that was difficult to read. The Valorian commander spoke about the choice before the colony, as if it were a simple calculation. They could avoid bloodshed by surrendering. They could preserve the majority of their population by accepting a fate of slavery. The commander presented it as a logical exchange, as if human life was a commodity to be bartered. What happened next changed everything. The Valorian commander made a critical error. He did not wait for a response. He made an example of one of the prisoners to demonstrate that his threats were genuine. One of the captured defenders was executed on the broadcast. One moment alive and defiant, and the next moment gone. The Valorian commander thought this would demonstrate his power and his willingness to follow through on threats instead. It triggered something that the Valorians had not anticipated and could not control. Nathan felt it more than saw it. First, a shift in the atmosphere of the colony, something fundamental changing in the collective consciousness of the people who had been defending their home for 18 days. The transformation that had been gradual and deliberate over those days suddenly became explosive and comprehensive. Emma stood from where she had been monitoring the medical systems. Her entire demeanor changed. Her exhaustion seemed to evaporate, replaced by something far more intense. Her expression became one of absolute resolve. Nathan understood in that moment that Emma was not a medical professional temporarily engaged in defense. She had become a protector of her people, and the death of someone under her care was something she would not forgive around the colony. The same shift was occurring. Defenders who had been fighting with control and discipline found a new level of determination and focus. Volunteers who had been following orders with dedication found themselves driven by something deeper and more primal. They were no longer defending. They were preparing to strike. Lucas moved through the command center with a different energy. His commands became sharper and more forceful. He began organizing an attack. He had been playing defensive for 18 days, and he had learned everything about how the Valorians fought. He had learned their patterns and their assumptions. He had learned their weaknesses, and now he intended to exploit all of them. Nathan watched as the colony mobilized. Not for defense, but for offense, civilians became soldiers in moments. The gentleness that had characterized even their earlier aggressive responses disappeared, replaced by focused and absolute determination to make the Valorians pay for what they had done. Victoria moved through the civilian shelters and for the first time made a different kind of speech. She told the people that their protectors would be taking action, that the colony would no longer play the role of victims waiting for assault. She told them to prepare for the possibility of more Valorian attacks, but to have faith in their defenders. She was still a protector, but now she was protecting something different. The right of the colony to strike back at him and the other. Young volunteers who had been running supplies suddenly found themselves assigned to much more aggressive roles. Lucas needed them to move swiftly through dangerous terrain, and Adam readily accepted the assignment. He was done running supplies. He was ready to actually fight. Marcus abandoned his defensive infrastructure improvements and began repurposing equipment for offensive capability. He created weapons platforms designed not for protection, but for attack. His understanding of the colony resources allowed him to improvise firing positions that could attack the Valorian encampment from unexpected angles. Every weapon in the colony was now aimed at the enemy. The assault began an hour after the execution. The colony did not announce it, did not warn the Valorians, did not give them time to prepare. The defenders moved out in coordinated teams directed by Lucas with precision and purpose. They were not confused. They were not chaotic. They were operating with the kind of focus that came from absolute clarity of purpose. Emma led medical teams that moved with the attack, treating wounded defenders while remaining in the thick of danger. She was a protector of life, yes, but now she was also ensuring that her defenders remained capable of continuing the assault. When someone fell, she was there. When someone needed encouragement, she provided it, moving through the battle with the same calm determination she had shown in the medical facility. The Valorians were shocked. The mercenary soldiers expected panic and desperation from human colonists. They did not expect coordinated assault. They did not expect defenders who had learned their tactics and could predict their movements. They did not expect people fighting with the fury of those who had lost someone and were determined that the loss would be answered. What happened over the next hours was not a traditional battle. The colony did not have superior numbers or superior firepower. The Valorians still held significant advantages in equipment and training. But the Valorians had lost something critical. They had lost the information asymmetry. They had lost the ability to predict what the humans would do, because the humans were no longer acting according to the calculations that govern most military forces. Marcus had his improvised weapons platforms in position exactly where the Valorians would funnel their retreat. He had studied the terrain for weeks, waiting for this moment, and his weapons created devastating crossfire for the enemy. Adam moved with strike teams that were coordinated by Lucas with almost supernatural precision. The young volunteer understood what was needed and moved with the urgency of someone who had finally transformed from support role to active combatant. The Valorian soldiers found themselves facing not defenders trying to survive, but fighters absolutely committed to destroying them. The difference was fundamental. The Valorians were professional soldiers operating within a calculated framework, but the humans were fighting for something deeper, for home, for family, for the right to exist. The Valorian advantage in training and equipment proved inadequate against the human advantage in purpose and commitment. As the assault drove deeper into the Valorian positions, the mercenary soldiers realized that they were losing not just the battle, but the entire engagement. They began to retreat. They began to fall back toward their ships. They began to understand that they had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of their enemy. Nathan documented everything, recording the movements, the tactics, the expressions on faces as the assault unfolded. He had come to witness human fury firsthand, and now he was seeing it unleashed, focused, and absolutely devastating. The fury was not wild or mindless, as the aliens would have described it. It was purposeful and directed. It was the fury of people protecting their home, their families, their right to exist. The assault continued through the night. The Valorians were forced to withdraw completely. They abandoned equipment and supplies and personnel in their desperate retreat to their ships. They launched from the surface planet with haste, leaving behind the wounded and dying of their mercenary force. When it was over and the colony emerged into the dawn light, Nathan looked out at the exhausted defenders, and he understood something fundamental about human nature, something that no strategic analysis could have captured. The people of Kepler 442b had been pushed past the point of acceptance, past the point of surrendering, past the point of accepting loss. And when that line was crossed, they had become something that their enemy had never anticipated. The work of recovery was slow and difficult, but steady. The colony had won, but the victory had cost them dearly. 7 defenders had been killed during the final assault. 23 more had been wounded, seriously enough to require weeks of recovery. Emma worked constantly treating injuries and helping the colony begin to rebuild what had been damaged in the siege. But she did so with a different demeanor now. She was still the dedicated healer, but she was also clearly someone who had experienced something profound, who had been tested and had discovered strengths she had not known. She possessed Lucas, remained in the colony to help establish new defensive systems and prepare for the possibility that the Valorians might return. He worked with the colony leadership to create permanent military structures, and he trained additional defenders in the tactics that had proved successful in the final assault. But more importantly, he helped the colony process what had happened. He understood that they had transcended something, and that they needed to understand what they had become. Victoria continued her work with the civilian populations, but now with a different understanding. She had watched her community transform, and she had learned that ordinary people could become extraordinary when purpose and commitment drove them. She began establishing a system to ensure that what the colony had learned would not be lost, that future generations would understand the lesson, that they would face challenges, but they would face them together. Nathan spent another week on the colony documenting stories and gathering information. He interviewed Emma and Lucas and Victoria and Adam and Marcus. He recorded their accounts of the siege, and particularly the moment when the mood had shifted from defensive to aggressive, from survival to retribution. He asked them why they had chosen to fight. When surrender might have ended the conflict more quickly, Emma told him that she had become responsible for the lives of the people she treated, and that responsibility transcended the logic of survival. She said that she could not have lived with herself if she had allowed the Valorians to take her colony into slavery, knowing that she had the capability to resist. She said that there were things that mattered more than safety, and that she had discovered that protecting those things was what made her feel most alive. Lucas explained that leadership meant being willing to make hard choices and to take responsibility for others. He said that surrender was always the easier path, but that choosing the harder path was what separated those who simply existed from those who truly lived. He said that his colony had chosen to truly live. Victoria spoke about her children and about the kind of world she wanted them to grow up in. She said that she could not have taught them to accept subjugation, that she could not have shown them that their home was not worth defending. She said that sometimes the most important thing a parent could do was teach their children that certain things were worth fighting for. Adam, who was still recovering from his wounds, spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested. He said that he had not known he was capable of the things he had done until he had been required to do them. He said that fear had not gone away, but that commitment had been stronger than fear. He said that now, when he thought about his future, He thought about it as someone who understood his own capabilities and his own strength. Marcus, the elderly engineer, spoke about purpose and usefulness. He said that when a person understood that they had something to contribute, something that no one else could provide, then age and exhaustion became irrelevant. He said that his improvised defensive systems had proved more effective than any conventional military equipment because they had been designed by someone who understood not just engineering but the specific terrain and resources available. He said that he had never felt more useful in his entire life. Nathan compiled all of this information into a comprehensive report. He documented the siege and the strategies employed. He recorded the transformation of the colony from civilian settlement into fighting force. He detailed the final assault and the complete routing of the Valorian forces. But most importantly, he captured something that could not be measured or quantified. In conventional military analysis, he captured the fundamental human quality that had made victory possible. He returned to the Galactic Council station 3 weeks after leaving it. As he walked through the corridors, he found the same military representatives preparing for another conference. They welcomed him back, asking about the colony situation, asking about the Valorian threat being concluded. Nathan requested time to present his findings. The conference organizers granted him a session before the Assembly of Galactic Military Leadership. The crystalline representative of the Kron was present. The fluid representative of the Vex Collective was there. The harmonic consciousness of the Sethari Dominion was represented, and there were dozens more representatives from species across the galaxy who had gathered to discuss the nature of modern warfare. Nathan stood before them and began to present what he had learned. He showed them tactical analysis and strategic information. He demonstrated how the colony defenders had adapted and evolved, and how they had ultimately defeated a superior force through superior understanding of their environment and their opponent. The military analysis was thorough, and the alien representatives nodded in recognition of the tactical innovations. But then Nathan shifted his focus. He told them about Emma, the medical professional who had discovered that healing was not her only capability. He told them about Lucas, the emergency coordinator who had learned to lead not through authority, but through the respect of those who followed him. He told them about Victoria, who had protected her community through courage and commitment. He told them about Adam, who had discovered that fear was not an obstacle to action, but merely an accompaniment to it. Nathan explained that the Valorians had made a fundamental error. They had assumed that humans fought based on calculation and strategy, that when the equation became unfavorable, humans would surrender. But that assumption was wrong. Humans did not fight because the odds favored victory. They fought because certain things mattered more than safety and security and survival itself. He told the assembly that humans were dangerous, not because they were superior in intelligence or technology, but because they chose to fight with everything they possessed when those they loved were threatened. He explained that the humans of Kepler 442b had not been trained soldiers. They had been ordinary people who had become extraordinary, not through military instruction, but through the discovery that they were capable of things they had never imagined. Nathan concluded his presentation by stating clearly that any civilization that underestimated the human capacity for commitment and sacrifice did so at their own peril. He said that humans would not always make logical choices by galactic standards, but they would make choices driven by purpose and meaning, and that those choices would be far more difficult to defeat than any amount of conventional military analysis could predict. The conference room fell silent. The alien representatives who had dismissed human warfare as chaotic and emotional were confronted with evidence that human emotion and commitment were not weaknesses, but strengths. The Vex Collective representatives seemed to recalculate something. The Sethari Dominion consciousness appeared to process something outside its normal parameters. The Kron representative stood absolutely still. One of the representatives asked Nathan if he was arguing that humans should be respected as a military power. Nathan answered that he was arguing something different. He was arguing that humans should be understood as beings who fought not for power or dominance, but for the right to protect what they loved. And that made them far more formidable than any amount of tactical superiority could overcome. As Nathan left the conference chamber, he reflected on his transformation. His understanding of warfare had been completely revised in the span of 3 weeks. He had come to the conference believing he understood the nature of conflict and had left knowing that he had only understood its surface features. The real nature of warfare revealed itself only when you witness people fighting not for abstract strategy, but for the concrete and profound right to protect their homes and their loved ones. War had been familiar to Nathan as an intellectual exercise, but witnessing human fury firsthand had changed everything. It had shown him that the most powerful force in the galaxy was not the most advanced technology or the most flawless strategy. It was the commitment of ordinary people to defend what mattered to them, even when the odds seemed impossible. That was what the aliens did not understand, and that was what made humanity formidable, not despite its emotional nature, but because of it.